It's been a lifelong goal of mine, I'd say, ever since my days in the university, probably when I was very struck by the Eurocentrism of the curriculum that was my education in comparative literature and literary studies in general. Even what really struck me was that even in, say, widely used anthologies like the Norton Anthology of World Literature, or there's a Norton Anthology of Literary Theory and Criticism, which are very explicit about their efforts to be global, right? So even within the framework of sort of global literary studies, global literary theory, the Eurocentrism there is very, very striking. Particularly, and this I think says something about just the discipline itself. What's really striking is, they might include, say, Alf Layla wa Layla, or they might include, I don't know, the Mahabharat from the Indian tradition. There's some effort, especially now, there's an effort to include excerpts of world literature and so forth. But what's really missing, I think, from this framework is a discussion about the aesthetics, non-European aesthetics, because these say Arabic text, even Sanskrit text, Persian text, whenever they're taught through a European framework. And if you're approaching literature, even from other countries, you're trying to be sort of global, but your framework still comes from, say, the Aristotelian tradition of, drama as the kind of the highest art, for example, right? Then there's going to be very significant limitations. And so I really wanted to make a contribution specifically to the theory of literature and from a non-European perspective. And then I discovered, actually it was while set in Syria. I was in Syria in 2010, learning Arabic and just learning about the culture. And I started learning about Jurjani, Abdelkader al-Jurjani, the incredible depth and richness of the Balakha tradition. So I realized that it wasn't so much a matter of kind of starting from the beginning, right? There's already a tradition of very extensive Arabic literary theory, literary criticism, and not just Arabic, but it begins obviously with Arabic. I mean, and that Persian and Turkic have their own sort of variations and responses to the Arabic tradition. And what was also really interesting to me was just the systematicity of this Balakha tradition. That it's already been very thought through at the very highest levels. The way that the mind receives the imagination, the way metaphors work, and similes, tashbih, the level of sophistication, the poetics of approaching basic questions in aesthetics is there, but you don't find it. You don't find these texts in, say, the Norton Anthology of World Literature. And there's really no place for someone who is not already, an expert in Arabic literature to kind of begin, right, with learning about these things. It's really only for specialists. And even, it even strikes me that even, say broadly, like in Syria already, in the Arabic world, there are not that many people who are really experts in these topics, like al-Jurjani or like the Balakha tradition, right? Exactly. So it's a pretty niche topic, but I thought, well, why should it be? Because I think it's important, even to everyday life, even to thinking about philosophical questions that affect everyone. It's not just a scholastic issue. So that was the basis of the project, to kind of contribute to the Balakha tradition as it's been theorized and thought from its beginnings and then later on, to elsewhere in the Islamic world, like the Mughal court in India. These texts were also read and interpreted, and then now sometimes in Arabic, sometimes in different languages. And so I was also interested in that kind of the way that the Arabic tradition kind of grew and flourished, sometimes in languages other than Arabic, in Central Asia, in Turkey, in Iran. So I proposed a project in which there would be specialists from across the Islamic literary tradition. So a specialist in Arabic Balakha, a specialist in Turkic Balakha, and a specialist in Persian Balakha. And I would be the one to bring these traditions together. We have translators, people who are sort of working full time on their specific area and then translating the text into English, providing introductions, and I'm editing their work. And the final output, we hope, is a very ambitious, maybe too ambitious, anthology that, I see it as something that would sort of complement, or in some cases, I don't want to say replace, but anyway, at least complement the Norton Anthology. That could be taught, at different levels, will be instructive for students, and will include the basic texts of Balakha from across the Islamic world. Sure. So I think the primary use is to do with just the appreciation of literary culture and how it manifests itself. I mean, one example that I think is kind of important is this to do with certain literary genres, right, that exist in the Islamic world, in Arabic and Persian and Turkic, and don't really exist certainly in contemporary English. So that what that means is people aren't really equipped to appreciate them. So I'm thinking of the qasida, for example, like al-Mutanabi. There are many great Persian qasida poets as well. It's really a foundational genre, right, literary genre for understanding poetry. But the problem is, well, there's 2 points. First of all, it's just there's no equivalent in English. I mean, we have odes, right? It's often translated as ode, but it doesn't quite capture it, number one. And number two, no one is writing odes in English now. So it looks like a very antiquated genre, right? When you try to explain it to a European audience. But I think when we have the theoretical framework for understanding the qasida, like its different parts, its relationship to the king, its relationship to the ghazal, right? When it's understood in its own terms, within its own tradition, then I think it becomes valid and relevant to any, there's a way of making it meaningful for any student of comparative literature, not just Arabic specialists. So yeah, I see that it's a way of a kind of accompaniment to certain genres that are seen to be untranslatable. I think understanding the Balagha tradition, or even, which I understand obviously very broadly, understanding the literary theoretical tradition of the Islamic world makes genres that are otherwise inaccessible accessible. And even going beyond that, I mean, I think there's a reason why certain genres are more important in certain cultures than others, right? So the qasida, for example, that's what I see. I mean, obviously it can be many different things. I don't want to limit the meaning of it, but one thing that's very striking to me as a reader of it is just the kind of power that the poems, qasida poetry, it's relationship to power, it's relationship to the king. And often poets who write these poems, I'm thinking like Mutanabi in the Arabic tradition, there's a Persian poet named Tahani who's very similar and very inspired by Mutanabi. They see themselves as kind of prophets, as kind of very, that's a bit of an exaggeration, but they're very persuaded of their importance. They're very ambitious. And they're kind of, in some ways, you could, I think, see a kind of, I don't know, maybe rivalry or a kind of, certainly at least a relationship between poetry and power that you don't see in, say, the lyric poetry of Keats, for example, right? Where poetry is often very removed from the world of politics, very removed from the world of, say, Parliament. No one recites poetry in Parliament in London, right? So then then what that means is that actually appreciating the qasida is also appreciating the power of poetry in general. And I don't think you can, I think that sometimes these texts don't speak for themselves. I mean, you actually do have to know what is the nature of the nasib, what is the relationship to the ghazal. It really helps with understanding the wider purpose. Yeah, exactly. But specifically, not just the historical context, right? Because we often know the context, but the aesthetic context, the literary context, the philosophical context, of what goes on inside the imagination, the relationship between tashbih and istiara in the poem, for example. So yeah, so those are the wider goals of the project. Sure, that's a really interesting question. So I guess about the nature of comparison itself. I think about what do you look for when you compare things, and how do you know if you're making a useful comparison or not? And it's a very important question. I think it's not thought about enough, even in comparative literature. Somehow it's just taken for granted that we know how to compare things. But often, we need a methodological perspective on the matter. So I think that in potentially it's possible to compare anything in a useful way, but you have to have a methodology. You have to know why you're doing it. And it shouldn't be, I mean, one, I guess, common comparison that takes place, because you didn't give specifics about like what aspect of my work. I'm not quite, so I'm answering a little bit in the abstract because I'm not sure if there's a specific reference there. But I'll just say what my principles are when I, approach the question, when I approach the matter. if there's not a kind of empirical link between the two things being compared, like say influence, the study of literary influence, like for example, if I was going to compare Keats, the lyrics of Keats and the qasidas of Mutanabi, right? For that could be either a good or a bad comparison. It could be either. I think what would make it effective is precisely a discussion, a theoretical framework, right? So if I just like look at the two texts and just like look at the way metaphor works, and I don't really think about deeper issues, it's probably not going to be a very useful comparison. It's going to be random. It's going to be arbitrary. And I do see those kinds of comparisons actually quite a bit happening. And so I think we want to, as comparatists, I think we should advocate for more kind of rigorous approaches to comparison, that it's not just a matter of kind of randomly picking two things and putting them together and seeing what happens. There's actually should be a reason, right? So I could, for example, yeah, I think, so again, just to take this example forward, I mean, looking for what is the nature of, what kind of aesthetic tropes are used, for example, in the qasidas compared to the lyric, and potentially I would find that, I don't know, that metonymy is really a kinaya, as it's often translated in Arabic, is often important to the lyric. In other words, it's about association, about like certain images occurring together, and maybe istiara is kind of the foundation for the qasida, right? So and then I could test that hypothesis and actually look, rigorously at each line. Is this what the image is? So I just think that there should be a kind of clear and independent theoretical question and framework for making a comparison. And with that framework, if that framework is sufficiently developed and really meaningful, then I think anything potentially can be compared usefully. But I think we should be careful about random comparisons that I often see. I mean, one example of a very random comparison I see is sort of any attempt to study, non-European literature without thinking about the specific literary theory that informs that work. That's an example of random comparison. Well, I think the most obvious difference is to do with the temporal framework of, say, post-colonial theory, which by definition should be concerned with, say, literature from the 1950s onwards, although it's not strictly defined, right? And GlobalLIT, which is, again, it's about a kind of a specific literary tradition that did flourish mostly before colonialism. So that's there's just a big empirical distinction. But along with that, the tools that are necessary to study that tradition and to do justice to it are quite different from the tools that shape post-colonial theory. Not that it's not. I mean, I'm certainly interested in post-colonial theory too. But foremost, training in classical Arabic, training in classical Persian, training in Ottoman Turkish. These are not and these aren't. I'm not fluent in, but I found postdocs who have these skills. Also, these are not qualities that post-colonial theory is characterized by, is known for. Right. I think one criticism, let's say, of I personally love Edward Said. He's a hero of mine, right? But there is a criticism of the book Orientalism, that it kind of arguably, right? And again, I'm not to criticize. He is a hero. I love the way he writes. I would never criticize Edward Said. I love him, but I think some people we can criticize some of the people who have taken his argument forward, and that they're based in Western universities. They don't read any language other than English. So in a sense, it kind of almost reinforces the very problems he's identifying, because they're not going beyond the Eurocentric framework. They're just looking at imperialism, which is worthwhile, but it doesn't help. It doesn't free us from that cage of the imperialist project. It just keeps us there. So I think we want to see the cage. We want to know what are our limitations. All of us. It's always useful activity, but I'm not satisfied with that either, because there's still an entire literary tradition before colonialism. So that's worth knowing about too. And I think it's really interesting to see how that actually did continue. In some cases. And certainly, I think in Egypt, in the Ottoman Empire, in Iran as well. I mean, the the Balakha tradition, the literary, these did continue in some ways, in very kind of invisible ways, ways that weren't visible to colonial rulers into the 19th century. So there is a little bit of overlap. I mean, in terms of the colonial period and the project, but most of it's from 500 or 1,000 years ago.
Interesting. Yes. So shedding light on the obscured languages, not only literature.
Exactly. Well, but the problem is that, I mean, if these texts say, even Asrar Balakha, Jurjani's texts, right? They're not translated to English except for a few excerpts, right? So if the texts themselves don't even exist in European languages, then they're not going to, until that happens, they're not going to have an impact on, because in most cases of the authors I'm talking about, there are no translations for these works. So the first step in really having an impact and expanding our conceptions of literary theory and demonstrating the importance and relevance of Balakha is simply the act of translating, right? The theory is very important to me, the concepts and so forth, but there's a simple empirical task of getting this material into English and making it accessible, and that's a kind of first priority, I think. So, I mean, it's obviously a huge tradition. I don't want to ignore something's going to be missed out in my answer, but just, I guess, to begin to answer that question, I mean, I think what's really distinctive about the Arabic tradition compared to, say, English or other German or other major literary traditions is the primacy of poetry, right? I mean, it's absolutely many theorists in the Balakha tradition sort of you could always find counter evidence, but from their perspective, poetry and literature are almost identical, right? They don't pay that much attention to, say, Alf Layla wa Layla or the prose works. Not that they're important too. I'm not there, and there's a theory of prose, but I think the most of the attention about the uses of metaphor or genre and so forth is in relationship to poetry. The most sophisticated theorization and the most sort of passion on the part of critics goes to poetry. Poetry is not actually I mean, that may sound contradictory or may sound impossible if I say that, but I don't think it's that important to certainly the way literature was taught to me, right? It's really the novel is the central genre in the English tradition, and you see that reflected in comparative literature, even a sort of, I mean, it's often thought that when people talk about literary theory, they're talking about the theory of the novel or the theory of the short story or something like that. And those are all, have their own worthwhile usefulness and relevance. But I think really for understanding poetry and drama, in another tradition, say the Aristotelian tradition, it's drama that's central. But I think where the Arabic tradition really excels, perhaps more than any other, and by Arabic, I also mean Persian and Turkish too, which are inspired by the Arabic tradition. And many authors, Persian and Turkic authors, were bilingual in Arabic as well. It's poetry, and specifically, as I mentioned, the qasida. The other poem genres are also really important, but there's just this kind of poetry that is really convinced of its power, and that is it has some kind of impact on the way that politics works. I think that's a very unique. It's not, you can see that also in maybe. Well, I don't know. I was going to say Indian traditions, but I think actually in Arabic it's even more fully expressed. So that's probably one of the major contributions. I mean, I think another thing that the project brings to light, which I haven't yet mentioned, is just the multilingualism of many of the authors and critics we're dealing with. Like, just to take the case of Jurjani, right? So he's a very great Arabic theorist in the Arabic language of literature, but he was writing in Iran. And so he would have spoken Persian. He has a few examples as well of Persian poetry, and many of the Persian and Turkic poets we're looking at were completely fluent in the Arabic tradition. And so it was just very, very normal for people to move back and forth between multiple languages, or for people to write in traditions that they weren't native to them, right? Whereas in the world we live in, basically people, except for English, which has this kind of power, I guess linked to imperialism, people tend to sort of just operate in the language of their national identity. And so it's not like that at all for the Islamic world. I think it enabled the something about the educational networks enabled Arabic to kind of be a global literature and language, and to be very foundational for people who were not speaking Arabic at home and who just understood that it was the literature of learning. Great question. So I suppose one thing that really struck me and that I'm still kind of trying to get to the bottom of to understand fully is the arguments and the Balaka traditions about the relationship between istiara, metaphor, and tashbih, which can be translated as simile or comparison. And I've noticed that I do think these are really complex subjects, so I may revise my opinion somewhat later, but I think in the Aristotelian tradition, Aristotle writes, that metaphor is the foundational trope, the most important trope. And I think, well, 2 points I want to make. First is that I think tashbih, comparison, has a much wider importance in the aesthetics, Arabic aesthetics, as well as Persian and Turkic aesthetics, than it has in poetry in, let's say, call it Western, that's too big of a word, but the Western poetry tradition, where simile is really just seen as a kind of derivative of metaphor. So yeah, that's of interest to me. And then also just the nature of the way metaphor is, what it means, how it's created, the idea that it's a borrowing of the qualities of something, of another object. It's just a different kind of aesthetic process, the way it's analyzed in the Balaka tradition. So those are kind of technical points about poetics, but just understanding the relationship between different kinds of tropes. And I would say the three main tropes that we're coming across are istiara, tashbih, and also kinaya, which again, it's not exactly a perfect translation, but metonymy would be the closest. Also finding, the relationship between these terms change over time and their meanings change over time. So it's not a kind of, you need some historical awareness to really understand how they're working. But you asked, sorry, about like the distinctive features. So those are, I think, some of the, what really doesn't have an equivalent in other traditions that I've come across. I think there's probably the one that's most exciting for me, or most interesting, is this kind of shift towards multilingualism, recognizing multilingualism. There's another ERC funded project that I will recommend to you and your listeners this and anyone who's involved in your projects. It's called, there's a website, it's probably easiest to find on the website, but I'll spell out the name. It's Mulosige, that's MULOSIGE, and that stands for something like multilingual locals. Anyway, look it up. There's a great website, lots of resources, and its whole point is precisely to kind of recognize the how world literature has been always multilingual, and that it requires more than one language really to kind of flourish, and how translation has played a role in stimulating literary culture. So yeah, I think that's probably the most significant one. It's particularly important, I mean, in our environment, and say places like the American Comparative Literature Association and so forth, where really English perspectives or certainly European perspectives remain dominant. So I think it has the most potential to kind of disrupt the Eurocentrism of comparative literature. The scholars were looking at multilingualism, especially through the framework of translation studies, and who are arguing. I think the whole idea of untranslatability, in other words, that you can't someone from a different culture can't access text in another one because cultural concepts are insurmountable or certain things can't be compared. I think these assumptions are being challenged really effectively by some of the new scholars, arguing against untranslatability. There's a few books like that, like Emily Apter, I think, or she argues on that subject. And so then there have been critics of her work that have also produced interesting commentaries and polemics. So that's probably where most of my attention is. And then also just going beyond genres like the novel. Another very inspiring scholar from my perspective, who's really opened my eyes, is the work of Sheldon Pollack. Pollock. He was at Columbia University, from where I got my PhD, and he's this expert of Indian literatures, but he's really been effective at, say, bringing Indian and Chinese literature into comparison, at thinking about poetry as a kind of central literary genre before modernity, and just bringing it all into a very contemporary context as well, which I think is important.